Thank you for listening to the Council of Institutional Investors, Voice of Corporate Governance. I'm Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of CII. The purpose of these monthly episodes is to update CII members and the general public on significant developments in corporate governance and capital markets regulation and CII's related advocacy activities. This update covers a period from April 1st to May 6th, 2025. The following is my top 10 list of events over that period. Number 10, an April 1st letter from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce asked the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee to increase oversight of proxy advisors and ESG rating firms, reform the shareholder proposal rules, and repeal the universal proxy rules. The letter says that the most urgent priorities are establishing robust oversight of proxy advisor firms and reorienting the shareholder proposal system back toward the interest of all investors. The Chamber asserts that voting recommendations made by proxy advisor firms or similar groups must be linked to the fiduciary duty of the clients and with economic returns. The letter expresses support for a bill introduced by Representative Brian Stile of Wisconsin that would require at least three new categories of federal regulations. One, require proxy advisors to register with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, become subject to rigorous oversight, and be held accountable for false or misleading statements. Two, prohibit investment managers from following proxy advisors' voting recommendations without first conducting proper due diligence. And three, bar activists from submitting frivolous shareholder proposals to public companies and from resubmitting certain proposals that previously garnered very low support. The Chamber also seeks the repeal of the universal proxy rules, which were approved by the SEC in November 2021. Those rules allow for universal proxy cards that list all duly nominated board candidates, allowing shareholders to vote for the precise combination of nominees they wish to represent them. The origin of the rules dates back to a 2014 Council of Institutional Investors rulemaking petition that reflected CII's member-approved policy endorsing universal proxy cards in contested elections at U.S. public companies. After filing the petition, CII drafted more than 20 letters and testimony in support of universal proxies. The Chamber says in its letter that universal proxies give an incentive to special interests to launch proxy fights at public companies for no compelling reason. The group also cites a situation last year in which the AFL-CIO used the universal proxy rules to solicit its own proxies with 5 proposals instead of submitting a shareholder proposal for inclusion in the company's proxy materials. The Union Federation sent a full set of its proxy materials to 68% of the voting power of the company and did not retain a proxy solicitor. By taking this approach, the AFL-CIO was not subject to the SEC rule restricting proponents to one proposal on each corporate proxy ballot. The Chamber letter says the SEC never considered the consequences of the universal proxy rule being used in such a manner. Chamber letter adds that investors as a whole will be harmed if a small minority of activists continues to exploit the universal proxy by forcing companies to engage in immaterial debates. Number 9, on April 11th, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission issued new guidance sheds more light on when companies must explain to their shareholders why executives were not forced to give up bonuses as a result of an accounting misstatement. In 2022, the SEC approved clawback rules publicly supported by the Council of Institutional Investors that include a requirement that companies reporting accounting corrections check boxes on the front of their annual SEC filings indicating that they evaluated whether their executives should pay back any compensation as a result of the error. The new guidance clarifies the circumstances in which a company is required to check the boxes on the cover of its annual report to indicate 2 types of information. 1, the financial statements included in the report reflect a correction of an error to previously issued financial statements, and 2, whether such error correction is a restatement that required a recovery analysis of incentive-based compensation received by executive officers during the relevant recovery period. Number 8, an analysis by CII staff published on April 10th finds that CII members who are asset owners largely kept the disclosure of their proxy voting and stewardship resources the same over the past year, but many asset manager members made significant changes, perhaps in response to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission recent guidance on 13D and 13G filings. Those changes generally fell into 4 categories. 1, some CII members softened their stance regarding how they vote on shareholder proposals. Instead of committing to a vote for or against proposals that meet certain criteria, some proxy voting policies now include significant discretion on what an engagement or voting response may look like in practice. 2, some CII members renewed their focus on core governance issues and in the process weakened their expectations from companies on diversity, environmental, social, and other topics. For instance, quantitative thresholds for board diversity are no longer present in many members' policies. 3, some CII members that previously shared proxy voting and stewardship resources publicly on their website no longer do so. And 4, several CII members retained their stewardship materials online, but structured their websites and in some cases made links to those resources less prominent. As indicated, these categories of revisions come in the aftermath of the SEC staff's February release of updated guidance on investors using Schedule 13G instead of the lengthier Schedule 13D. Generally, shareholders holding more than a 5% stake in a company must file a Schedule 13D with the SEC, but passive or institutional investors are allowed to file a short form Schedule 13G as long as they certify they are not holding stock in a company for the purpose of influencing control of the company. The revised SEC guidance provides that shareholders are no longer eligible to use a 13G if, during a company engagement, the shareholder attempts to influence or control the company to take specific actions by conditioning support of one or more of the company's director nominees at the next director election on the company's adoption of its recommendation. Further, investors are no longer eligible to use 13G if the investor discusses with management its voting policy on a particular topic and states or implies that it will not support one or more of the company's director nominees at the next director election unless management makes changes to align with the shareholders' expectations. Yours truly had a call with SEC staff members on February 26th to obtain clarification on the new guidance. The Q&A developed from that call and discussed on a previous Voice of Corporate Governance podcast provides more details about how the SEC plans to apply the guidance going forward. Number 7, on April 9th, the U.S. Senate confirmed Paul S. Atkins as the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission chair in a 52-44 party line vote. Atkins was officially sworn in as the new chairman of the SEC on April 21st. Atkins served as an SEC commissioner from 2002 to 2008 and from 1990 to 94 as chief of staff and counselor, first to SEC chair Richard Breeden and then to SEC chair Arthur Levitt. From 2009 to 2010, Atkins was a member of the Congressional Oversight Panel for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was created following the 2008 financial crisis to help stabilize the U.S. financial system, restart economic growth, and prevent avoidable foreclosures. After leaving the SEC, Atkins founded and has been CEO of Potomac Global Partners, which offers consulting services to banks, financial services firms, and some digital asset firms. Atkins is replacing acting SEC chair Mark Ueda. With Ueda retaining his seat on the commission, the SEC's composition now stands at 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. Number 6. On April 30th, a hearing was held by the U.S. House of Representatives Education and Workforces Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, entitled Investing for the Future, Honoring ERISA's Promise to Participants. Hearing witness AFL-CIO Deputy Director of Corporations and Capital Markets, Brandon Rees, pushed back against efforts to limit the freedom of retirement plan fiduciaries to consider ESG risk when making investment and proxy voting decisions. Rees pointed out that the CFA Institute reports that 85% of chartered financial analysts take ESG factors into consideration, and the Capital Group found that 90% of institutional investors consider ESG factors. Furthermore, Rees cited an academic overview of over 2,000 research papers that showed only 10% of the reviewed studies found a negative relationship between ESG and corporate financial performance, and the large majority of the reviewed studies reported positive findings. Rees said he supports the Department of Labor's 2022 rule entitled Prudence and Loyalty in Selecting Planned Investments and Exercising Shareholder Rights, which Rees said clarified that retirement plan fiduciaries may consider, but are not required to consider, ESG factors just as they would consider any other investment factor. By contrast, Rees said he opposes the two regulations put in place during the Trump administration that the 2022 rule reversed. Rees said that those regulations introduced confusing new language by attempting to distinguish between pecuniary and non-pecuniary factors. Rees said that the vague language is not found in the text of the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 and would have a chilling effect on financially beneficial investments and increase plan expenses to the detriment of retirement plan participants and beneficiaries. Rees also defended retirement funds' right to vote proxies considering ESG factors and to file shareholder proposals on ESG issues. Rees told lawmakers that legislation to limit the ability of private sector retirement plans to consider ESG factors, file shareholder proposals at companies they own, or vote proxies has more in common with a totalitarian command economy than a free market system. Hearing witness Charles Crane, Managing Vice President of Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, testified that ESG investing decisions in the ERISA context involve the prioritization of plan managers' political goals over the views of plan participants that may or may not hold the same values, as well as the subordination of the participants' retirement savings in service of political pursuits. Crane also took the opportunity to criticize ERISA plans' use of proxy advisors. He said that proxy firms do not have a fiduciary duty to ERISA plan participants and beneficiaries, so they are free to exert their outsized influence as they see fit. Crane also told the subcommittee that proxy advisors recommend that ERISA plans and other institutional investors vote in accordance with their preset one-size-fits-all voting guidelines. Subcommittee Chair Rick Allen of Georgia introduced the Protecting Prudent Investment of Retirement Savings Act, which would reinstate the two regulations put in place during the first Trump administration that were reversed by the Department of Labor's 2022 rule. Last September, the House passed similar legislation introduced by Chair Allen, but the bill died in the U.S. Senate. Number 5. On April 28th, proxy advisor Glass Lewis announced it's making some changes to its business model. Proxy advisor said it was taking the step to eliminate the misperception of influence, and in doing so, making it clear that ownership of the proxy voting decisions lies squarely in the hands of shareowners. Glass Lewis also indicated that it will open its platform to third-party voting policies beginning with the 2026 proxy season. Additional policy options from other organizations, including other proxy advisors and institutional stakeholder groups, will be offered as alternatives to the Glass Lewis House policy. Additionally, over the next 3 years, Glass Lewis will work with clients wishing to use custom voting policies. Its goal is to have the majority of its institutional asset management and pension fund clients opting to implement their own firm-specific guidelines while continuing to rely upon Glass Lewis's underlying analysis to inform final vote decisions. At the same time, Glass Lewis will continue to offer its house policy and issue vote recommendations. In a statement, Glass Lewis said, "Our decision to transition to a business model that accommodates these diverse perspectives is not politically motivated. Rather, we simply believe it will ultimately benefit our clients and all stakeholders across the proxy voting ecosystem." Number 4, on April 29th, a hearing was held by the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee's Subcommittee on Capital Markets entitled Exposing the Proxy Advisor Cartel, How ISS and Glass Lewis Influence Markets. Subcommittee Chair Ann Wagner of Missouri stated that This is not about silencing shareholders. It's about ensuring the proxy process advances long-term investor value, not narrow political agendas. Chair Wagner added that the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission must reassert its role in ensuring this system is fair, transparent, and accountable. Subcommittee's ranking member, Brad Sherman of California, and hearing witness Nell Minow, vice chair of Value Edge Advisors, questioned why the hearing did not include the testimony of any institutional investors who are clients of ISS and Glass Lewis. Minow said, I think it would be useful for this committee to hear from institutional investors who use these services so it can understand why they buy them, how they use them, and when they vote with or against them. Similarly, Ranking Member Sherman said that the loudest and most persuasive testimony is the testimony that has not been spoken. He pointed out that no large institutional investors have complained about proxy advisors. He added that the complaints are coming from those representing corporate America, those who do not want the owners of corporate America telling the managers of corporate America what to do. Minow pointed out that two proxy advisors are not actually cartels because there's no barriers for other firms to begin offering similar services to investors. She cited several other firms that either did or still do offer proxy advisor services. Minow also refuted arguments about proxy advisors' influence over shareholder votes. She pointed out that in 2024, ISS recommended a vote with management on 96% of the management proposals, which represent anywhere between 93 to 98% of the voted items, and those proposals received 96% of the vote. Looking at the other items that went to votes, Minow explained that 2024, for Russell 3000 companies, ISS recommended voting against 12% of the proposals on executive pay, but fewer than 1% failed to receive majority support. Minow summarized her testimony in 4 points. 1, proxy advisors recommend a vote with management more than 90% of the time. 2, no institutional investors are required to purchase proxy advisor services. 3, sophisticated financial professionals who wish to get independent analysis of proxy votes have a range of choices or proxy advisor firms, but ultimately make their own voting decisions. And 5, ultimately, it is corporate insiders who decide whether to abide by a shareholder's vote. Hearing witness Paul Washington, president and CEO of the Society for Corporate Governance, told the subcommittee that proxy advisors should be subject to light touch regulation. Washington stated that if it is determined by the D.C. Circuit that the SEC lacks authority to regulate proxy advisor firms under its solicitation rules, Congress should enact legislation to confirm the SEC's authority to oversee these firms and their activities. Moreover, Washington's light touch regulation would include the following 5 requirements, some of which go far beyond the 2022 SEC rules promulgated under SEC Chair Jay Clayton during the first Trump administration. 1, proxy advisor firms should be required to provide advance copies of the reports to the companies that are the subject of the report on a complimentary basis, with a reasonable amount of time for companies to identify any factual, analytical, or other errors. 2, clients of proxy advisors should be provided with a hyperlink to the company's response to the proxy advisor's analysis and recommendations. 3, proxy advisors should be required to disclose the empirical basis for their voting policies. 4, proxy advisors should be required to provide increased information regarding actual or potential conflicts of interest that arise from multiple roles they perform. And 5, proxy advisors should be prohibited from offering an automated voting service that allows the proxy advisor firms to make and execute voting decisions on behalf of investment advisors without any ongoing oversight by these clients, aside from the approval of general guidelines and policies before proxy season begins. Hearing witness Charles Crane, Managing Vice President of Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, testified that ISS's and Glass Lewis's influence effectively dictates corporate governance policies for America's capital markets. Crane also said proxy advisors have substantive beliefs and normative agendas about how public companies should be run, and they use these to make voting recommendations. Crane asserted that proxy firms' provision of proxy voting advice is a solicitation under Section 14A of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, and he encouraged Congress to make that clear. Crane also brought up the issue of conflicts of interest at ISS, explaining that the proxy advisor operates a consulting service through which it offers guidance to companies on the topics that will be the subject of ISS's voting recommendations. Crane added that the main benefit of this advice for public companies is that it helps them avoid adverse vote recommendations from ISS's proxy voting business. Number 3. In connection with the aforementioned April 29th hearing of the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee's Subcommittee on Capital Markets, the subcommittee distributed a number of discussion draft bills that would increase the regulation of proxy advisor firms, including the following 6 discussion drafts. First, a bill sponsored by Representative Brian Stile of Wisconsin. The bill would require proxy firms to register with the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission as a condition of registration. Proxy firms would be subject to the following 7 requirements. 1, provide companies with the data and information underpinning their recommendations and grant companies an opportunity to share feedback to correct errors and misrepresentations. 2, employ an ombudsman charged with engaging with companies and resolving issues identified by impacted businesses. 3, include any company statements responding to the firm's recommendations and final reports to clients. 4, certify the firm has sufficient staff and resources to provide voting advice based on accurate information and in the economic best interests of shareholders. 5, provide disclosures on the firm's procedures, methodologies, organizational structure, professional qualifications, and code of ethics. And 6, adopt policies to identify, disclose, and manage any conflicts of interest. And finally, 7, prohibit proxy advisors from providing advisory or consulting services that present a conflict of interest with respect to their proxy voting recommendations. A second discussion draft bill, also sponsored by Representative Stile, would clarify that failure to disclose material information associated with proxy voting advice, such as information about a proxy firm's methodologies, sources of information, and conflicts of interest, would render the advice false or misleading. A third discussion draft bill issued in connection with the hearing was sponsored by Representative Barry Loudermilk of Georgia. The bill would require investment advisors, asset managers, and pension funds relying on the services of proxy firm to explain how the firm's recommendations impacted their proxy votes, analyze their voting decisions based on investors' economic best interests and the institution's fiduciary duty, and disclose the degree to which the institution voted in line with the firm's recommendations. The bill would also require that institutions certify that their voting decisions were made based solely on the economic best interests of their customers and beneficiaries. For larger institutions, the bill also would require them to disclose the economic analysis underpinning any voting decisions that diverged from the recommendation of a company's board of directors. A fourth discussion draft bill distributed in connection with the hearing was sponsored by Representative Zach Nunn of Iowa. The bill would prevent institutional investors from outsourcing proxy voting decisions to proxy advisor firms via the firm's so-called robo-voting services. It also direct the SEC to promulgate a new rule limiting robo-voting. The bill says robo-voting allows the proxy advisors to automatically cast investors' proxy votes in line with the firm's preferred policies. A fifth discussion draft bill issued in connection with the hearing was sponsored by Representative Scott Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. Bill would prevent proxy advisors from offering proxy voting advice if a conflict of interest exists as a result of their consulting services. And a sixth discussion draft bill issued in connection with the hearing was sponsored by Chair Wagner. The bill would require the SEC to conduct a comprehensive study on the proxy process. The bill would examine the role of proxy firms, analyze the effectiveness of SEC's Rule 14a8, and illustrate the costs of politically motivated shareholder proposals. Number 2, on April 29th, at a meeting of the Investor Advisory Group of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, yours truly announced that the Investor Advisory Group was seeking nominations from the general public, including audit committee chairs and members, auditors, financial analysts, investors, and academics for what they believe to be the most investor decision useful critical audit matters or key audit matters contained in public company audit reports of 2024 Form 10-K or Form 20-F filers. Those nominations, which may be submitted anonymously, should include for each matter nominated a minimum 500-word explanation as to why the individual submitting the nomination believes the matter provides decision-useful information to investors. All submissions should be sent via email to Jeff, Jeff, at CII.org. The deadline for submissions is June 30th, 2025. All eligible nominations received will be reviewed and evaluated by the members of the Investor Advisory Group. Members of the Investor Advisory Group will vote for the 3 critical or key audit matters among those nominated that they believe provide the most useful information to investors. The 3 critical or key audit matters receiving the highest votes will be identified and are expected to be discussed at an Investor Advisory Group later this year, followed by a public report that is expected to be issued prior to year end. The goal of this annual initiative is to encourage independent auditors to voluntarily improve the quality of information communicated to investors in the audit reports of public companies. For all those listening to this podcast, please consider submitting at least one nomination by the June 30th deadline. And my number one most significant development, U.S. corporate governance, capital markets regulation for the period from April 1st to May 6th occurred on April 30th, when the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee approved in a 30-22 party line vote a provision in the budget reconciliation bill that would fold the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board into the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Created in 2002, the wake of accounting scandals and Enron of WorldCom, the PCAOB's mission, as stated on its website, is to regulate the audits of public companies and SEC-registered brokers and dealers in order to protect investors and further the public interest in the preparation of informative, accurate, and independent audit reports. Representative Janella Bynum of Oregon said during the committee markup that now is not the time to weaken the protections that keep corporate executives honest. The last thing that a retiree or worker saving for retirement needs is a higher risk of losing their savings because Washington dismantled an oversight board without proper safeguards. Counsel of Institutional Investors sent a letter to the committee on April 30th opposing the provision in the reconciliation bill that CII argues would effectively eliminate the PCAOB. CII letter asserts that the provision is in direct conflict with the CII membership-approved policy that the responsibility to promulgate auditing standards should reside with an industry-independent private sector body that has a secure, stable source of funding and is accountable to investors. Previous day, yours truly delivered remarks before the PCAOB's Investor Advisory Group regarding the legislative provision. In those remarks, I told the group that I believe it is important this morning that we reflect on the fact that we appear to be at a critical point in the history of the U.S. auditing profession, when the private sector body that was created to save the profession from its own failings is now at risk of being effectively eliminated with the implicit support of the profession it saved. I also indicated in my remarks that the inspections of audit firms conducted by the PCAOB, particularly the inspections in mainland China or Hong Kong, could not likely be performed effectively in the near term, if at all, should they become the responsibilities of the SEC. The budget reconciliation bill is currently expected to reach the House floor for vote before Memorial Day. That completes my monthly U.S. corporate governance and capital markets update. If you have any questions regarding any of the issues discussed, please feel free to email me at Jeff, that's JEFF, at CII.org. Until next time, I'm Jeff Mahoney. Thanks again for listening to the Voice of Corporate Governance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Voice of Corporate Governance, brought to you by the Council of Institutional Investors. The Voice of Corporate Governance is a free, non-sponsored podcast that highlights critical developments in corporate governance and other important issues affecting institutional investors. The views expressed by those interviewed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of CII or its members. For more information on CII and its policies on corporate governance, please visit our website at www.cii.org.